Why digital trust should be number one in your institution's privacy practices. With Joanna and Jim, I am going to hand this next piece over to my dear colleague, Kate Giovacchini, who's the Managing Director of the Trusted Learner Network and really is the Director of the Digital Trust Initiatives here at ASU. And I'm going to ask Kate if she would introduce our guests. Kate, are you there with me?
Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today, and it's my great honor to introduce our plenary session speakers here in the Sunset session. We'll be joined in a conversation with Jim Siegl. Jim Siegl, CIPT, is a senior technologist with the Youth and Education Privacy team at Future of Privacy Forum. In addition to many of Jim's accolades, I will also call out that he was a co-author of the COSIN Privacy Toolkit and the Trusted Learning Environment TLE SEAL program. He also holds a Master of Science in the Management of Information Technology from the University of Virginia. And joining Jim will be Joanna Grama. She is a senior fellow at the Future of Privacy Forum. Joanna joins us from a big background in law, higher ed, data privacy. She's got some interesting bona fides, but the one I wanted to call out was the third edition of her textbook, Legal and Privacy Issues in Information Security, was published in late 2020. So run, I'm assuming, to Amazon or your local bookstore to pick up that sucker. It's a great pleasure to have these folks from Future of Privacy Forum here to speak with us. And we will be turning it back over to you two and to Donna Kidwell we're going to do a fireside chat here. So Donna, I turn it back to you to start us off with our first question.
Thank you. I was just, as we were doing this, okay, we're good. We got a message that you can't actually hear my dogs very well, which is a little disappointing because Zoom is so good at handling all of our noise reduction. She really is a lovely dog, and she's probably sad that she can't join and you can't hear her, but yay for Zoom. I wanted to go back and mention the mini concert that we have, because I did see that in the Slack too. Mr. Warwick Pond will be performing live for us. So I don't want to have missed him. Thank you so much, Kate, for that lovely introduction of Joanna and Jim. It's an absolute pleasure to have them here and really to think about the work that the two of you are doing at the Future of Privacy Forum. And I might start right there and basically ask, can you tell us a little bit about the forum? Like, what is it that you guys do? What is your mission? It's a really captivating title, but help us understand a little bit more what the forum's really all about.
Great. Thank you, Donna. It's a real pleasure to be here. Future of Privacy Forum is an independent nonprofit that serves as a catalyst for privacy leadership and scholarship. We bring together industry and academics, civil society, even policymakers and other stakeholders to explore some of the challenges that are posed by emerging technologies. And we develop privacy protections and ethical norms and workable best practices around this. Our work streams cover the whole range of critical privacy issues, and they include artificial intelligence and algorithms, biometrics, location data, smart cities and cars and IoT, data ethics, ad tech ethics, de-identification, health, and genetic data. And as you mentioned, Kate, Joanna and I work on the Youth and Education team, which, among other projects, manages the Student Privacy Pledge for EdTech vendors, and more than 460 education technologies have signed that pledge, taking on legally enforceable obligations, including a commitment to collect student personal data for educational purposes only. That's a little bit about us.
I had to find my mouse. That's fantastic. I'm curious in the chat, how many of you heard about the pledge? I'm watching. I think it's worth going into that pledge a little bit more. What's the story behind the pledge? It's a surprise question.
That's okay. I was just grabbing the URL to provide some info for folks. So on the Youth and Education team, we deal with youth and children's privacy, higher education privacy, and K-12 privacy. And one of the the big seismic events in education in privacy happened in about 2014, and there were a large number of laws that were passed in that 2-year period around K-12 primary and secondary education. There was a lot of concerns around privacy and data collection for K-12 students. So the vendor pledge was a collection of principles, a collection of 12 principles that vendors voluntarily committed to. But as a pledge, it's a legally enforceable pledge. So this actually is something that has legal substance and can be enforced by the Federal Trade Commission or state attorneys general.
So I love that. You know, not only is it a values-based commitment, but it's actually legally enforceable and has some teeth. That's really impressive. You know, that kind of thing really, I think, pulls together these ideas from the very start, not only around digital trust, but also around data privacy, and then thinking about policy and information security practices. And, you know, Joanna, I know that's really part of what you've spent a lot of your career really dedicated to. So I'd love to hear just kind of where would you even start thinking about those things together in the same breath?
Every question will be a great question, but that's a really meaty question because it gives privacy professionals and information security professionals an opportunity to share their learning journey. And I will have to say that when I started working in information security years ago, I worked for a group of people that if they weren't the department of no, they were very much the department of, we know what's best for you. And it wasn't paternalistic, but it kind of was, right? And it was, you know, sort of old school information security. And when we talked about privacy, it wasn't the way we're talking about privacy today. It was, you know, just trust us with your data. It'll be okay. Give us your data. We're going to do things, but it's all in your best interest. The conversations weren't rich. And what I think digital trust does is it sort of creates this Venn diagram between privacy, information security, and put digital trust in the middle. Because today, a little bit when we talk about security, you might hear notions of zero trust, trust no one, you know. And so sometimes security professionals, we're still talking about security in terms of, you know, give us some data to make us trust you. And when we talk about privacy, we're talking a little bit about, here's all the things we do so that you can trust us. But digital trust sort of operates in this space where we can have confidence and flexibility and empowerment and these micro interactions that allow trust to be two ways, right? And that's what I think is really, it really changes the way we can think and talk about information security and privacy in a way that maybe we couldn't before. And so I'm really a great big huge fan of using digital trust to link information security and privacy, because then you don't have to have this competition for superiority, right? Which one comes out on top? We can say both of them are really, really important, and they're linked by this notion of digital trust.
I'm curious, because you've got a legal background. I think privacy is one of these things where it's tough to know like who's got the ball. And so it does strike, as I'm, you know, in CISO rooms and listening to CISOs, I do get the sense that digital trust gives us a different kind of package to think about where your conversations with privacy can happen when they do touch on issues of security. So I'd love some thoughts from you on that, because it's not always easy to like break down the silos of who owns risk, who owns the legal side of this. It can get pretty confounding.
Right, it can be pretty confounding. And the best thing about higher education is at least we have an environment where we can work on these really tough issues together and we're not afraid of them, right? Academic freedom and academic inquiry at least makes us not afraid. There are pretty much two, in my opinion, there's two schools of thought going on right now in the privacy community. One is privacy as a compliance activity. Can we or can we not do that with data? Is there a law that either prevents it, prohibits it, limits it, or does something to define what we can do with data. You see some laws sort of addressing that from an information security perspective as well here and there. HIPAA and GLBA, for instance, in the higher ed space, we see some regs in those regards. But it's harder to legislate information security because technology changes so fast. But privacy has some basic concepts. There's a second movement within the discipline of privacy that doesn't just look at that can we do it question. It starts to look at the should we do it question and how should we do it question. And that's where you start to see things like the fair information privacy practices or the any of the other best practices frameworks regarding privacy principles. And digital trust really enhances those conversations, right? Because when you can show that you're following those principles, you're doing things to help enable trust. And so I think that that's really cool. I think we're going to see a seismic shift in the practice of privacy in the next couple of years, moving away from that compliance question, because at the end of the day, we've got lawyers that can figure it out eventually, the yes or no part, but the should we part, that's the part that's really interesting. And that's the part that digital trust is going to help define those conversations.
Yeah, I love that. I remember in the early days of the web, still getting a sense of like what you could get from web analytics and what kind of things you could get from logs, and then feeling like we needed all the things because we didn't really know what all we could get. And we were still trying to figure out, okay, now we get it. What does it mean? And what could it mean if you did something with it? It's lovely to think that we're now getting to the place not of let's take all the things, but should we? And what things are relevant and what things are meaningful. That tenet around transparency and help. Really, you can't be helpful if you don't have a sense of why you've got that data in the context for what you're trying to do. That's our expression of it. I love your forecast for where this is. You know, I'm also kind of curious. If you need some way of thinking about how you're going to do, I don't know, like an impact assessment, you need some framework to put this in. And Jim, you've had some really interesting work in K through 12, really working and thinking of your work in the IT passes. Could you tell us a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, and one of the conversations that we really wanted to have today was about, you know, how do you integrate digital trust into your institution's privacy practices? This is something that's, it's a strategic conversation, but it's also a very tactical one. And one of the places I think is really interesting to look at that pivot is around how an organization adopts new technology. I spent most of the last 18 years as a technology architect for a very large school district, 200,000 students. So in many ways, some of the same characteristics of a large university. And I did what I imagine many of the folks on this Zoom call do day in and day out, evaluating the impact of new technology, and when sometimes looking at the impact of technology that we had already implemented. So that you look at that through a number of different lenses. If you're in security, this is a risk analysis exercise. You perform a security assessment. You get a copy of the HECVAT. You check vendor certifications. You may do penetration testing. If you're wearing the privacy hat, it might be a compliance review. You might do a privacy impact assessment. You know, sometimes you're doing this due diligence as part of an RFP, and you're reviewing contracts and reference checks or negotiating SLAs. But more often not that we're looking at these as kind of discrete silos. So, you know, I'm a big proponent of frameworks and checklists. Coming from that architect background, they provide consistency and repeatability, and they're really good communication tools. And I think one of the things that's so key in building trust is that consistency and building norms and meeting expectations. So when I was in my role as an architect in the K-12 world, a lot of my job was vetting new technology. And I use that term and I hang on to that term vetting because it always gives me kind of a clear guide star as to what I'm doing. And I think about, as the liberal arts major that I was, the origin of the word veterinarian. And that was the job of the person that was responsible to check the horse, to make sure that they were healthy and that they were sound and that they were allowed to run. So that's how I look at vetting technology. Is it healthy and safe and sound and good to go? So I had an 8-letter acronym that I used to kind of capture what that vetting meant to me and to my users and stakeholders. And I used the term "it passes," and it stood for integration, how we're connecting these systems together, whether that's on an integration and authentication level, SAML, or data flows, LTI, training, making sure the people that were supporting the system were trained, but also making sure that there was training resources available for the end users. Privacy, impact of privacy, accessibility, security, supportability, ethics, and one that is particularly important in the K-12 world, safety. And this was a useful tool for me as a framework, and I saw this work on several levels. It was useful as a high-level checklist to make sure as I was going through my day and looking at the architecture of a new system that I was capturing all of the things. It was also really useful as a map of building a solution. It let me put what I was responsible for in the realm of privacy and have a conversation with the person that was responsible for security or the person that was responsible for accessibility. And we could look at this as a mental model of how their area of responsibility played a role in the delivery of the whole and delivering a trusted service for the learners. It was also really useful in talking and picking apart how the different parts interacted to create or to break trust and break user expectations. I think about how very early in the pandemic, back in March, when we flipped the switch and started making heavy use of web conferencing tools integrated with the learning management system. And it became clear that integration and privacy and ethics pillars weren't aligned, and it was breaking trust for some of our users. Specifically, the learning management system used the student's username, and the LTI integration was passing that legal name rather than their preferred name to the web conferencing tool. And this was creating a privacy issue. This was, at the time, this was something that really had not been well addressed in K-12 in our institution. And very quickly, this got up to a school board level awareness. And I'm very pleased to say that this was the first time in my experience where a school board member a member of leadership could clearly articulate what the value of privacy was in terms of the way that these systems worked. And I think some of that was being able to describe how these things interacted and what people's roles were in building these trusted systems. So that's what my list was. And some of these things have particular meaning and utility in architecting K-12 systems. But my point here is not to suggest that this is a framework that would be appropriate for ASU, but I really wanted to start a conversation. So if digital trust is more than just the sum of privacy and security and reliability, then when we look at onboarding new technologies, new systems, upgrades, emerging technologies, we need to vet the technology as more than the sum of the risk that is managed by the various experts and stakeholders. And I don't have an answer for this, but I really want to have the conversation with the folks today. What what would an impact assessment for digital that was focused on digital trust look like when adopting new technologies and new projects in the ASU community?
I'm going to give that a little bit of time because we've got a chat people could answer.
Yeah.
We've got a chat people could answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Hey, you can't be the one that answers.
And certainly there are other things that may be factors in your environment. I was looking at the Slack chat, and someone asked, what about digital ownership? So one of yours may be content, and thinking about ownership of content. This was a strong theme in a number of the state level privacy laws that have been passed in the last couple of years, particularly in the K-12 area, but many of those laws had requirements that a learner could have the right to download their own content, and that actually put requirements on ed tech vendors. So the idea of learner content ownership is part of something that may build trust, that I'm investing as a learner, I'm investing my time, I'm investing my creativity, my learner capital in this system. And I trust that when I leave the institution, that I'm going to be able to get what my own work out. So that may be something that factors into what you look at when you're evaluating for trust in your environment.
I love that, Jim. I love the idea that that we may now have a point where we've got a kind of technological sophistication where we could be thinking about what is that evidence of this incredible hard work that you've done in a deeper way than maybe the traditional things that we've had for decades, transcripts and some of our traditional harbingers of, but they're kind of brute force, right? And we might be at a place now where all this extraordinarily, if you're in marketing, data exhaust could actually be used towards understanding the work of learning and understanding the fruits of learning and understanding, and then not only understanding, but like giving it back to people. Before we go too far off on that, I want to kind of loop back because I think in the context of the conversation we're going to have over the next couple of days, a lot of it passes is going to feel really relevant. You added in accessibility. And I wonder if you could spend just a minute or so, talk to us about putting in accessibility. At ASU, our charter starts with who has access and how they include, but it is hard to think about accessibility as part of that. It's hard to resource it. There's a lot that goes in. So I'd love to hear a little bit on what your thinking was to include that.
Thank you. And I'm really glad you highlighted that one. So part of that is thinking about the system as a whole. And who's a user in that system. And accessibility, one of the reasons that accessibility is there is making sure that when you think about privacy, you're thinking about privacy in a system that works for all users.
No, that's really great.
There are a couple of things that have come up in the chat that really are intriguing. I'm gonna, if it's okay, I'm gonna pull a couple of them out.
Yeah, it is okay.
And react to them. So Kevin mentioned Zoom, which is obviously a huge factor in our lives in the last 16 months, and about end-to-end encryption. Expanding on that one, one of the things I think about is we all adopted these technologies that weren't really designed as learner technologies. They were business technologies that we used kind of occasionally, and we had to make some very rapid changes. Obviously, one of the consequences of that around security was certainly the Zoom bombing phenomena. We saw that in K-12. I'm sure as much as higher ed. These are products, Zoom, but also tools heavily used in K-12, Google and Google Meet. And when you have I spent a lot of time doing security testing, but there is nothing that can break a product faster than a a 13-year-old with a lot of time on their hands. So, you know, those were really good ways of testing where the limits were. You know, a business tool feature that would let a user dial into a meeting without prompting for a password, or letting anyone in the meeting admit someone, or letting anyone in the meeting click a link and dial out to an arbitrary phone number. Those are all things that work great if you're in an environment where you have absolute trust of everyone that's in the meeting. And you may have different kinds of trust when you're in a classroom situation. So those are certainly, there's a lot to mine when you think about the web conferencing use cases, and bringing that into learning.
Yeah, I love, Jim, that you brought that up, because, you know, if you think of the context of that learning experience, depending on what that experience is, you might be with a cohort that you've been with for a while. You've, you know, for the most part, maybe, you know, 60% of your class, and you've known them for 3 years or whatever, versus being in a university setting where you might actually be mixing it up from every single class. And so your trust with your faculty, your trust with the administration, your trust with your cohorts really shifts just inside those experiences. Joanna, I'm kind of curious if I can pull you in a little bit and ask you, you know, what are some other places where you would think higher ed might have similar or maybe even deltas from what happens in K through 12?
Sure. Two thoughts first. Accessibility is really, really interesting. And I think one of the ways to continue to enhance digital trust with our entire populations is to not backslide once our response to COVID-19, the pandemic, is over. We had this huge, phenomenal pivot to technology 18 months ago, a year ago, forever ago, right? And we implemented technologies and used technologies that some people in the disability rights community have been asking for a very long time, right? And they had been told by institutions and organizations, we can't give you that accommodation, that's too hard, that requires too much technology. And yet, in response to a global pandemic, many of these things were implemented and that type of accessibility was created. And so one of the things that I'm kind of worried about from a privacy perspective is what happens when we, I hope we don't backslide now that we're returning to normal. And I think that that's a really important accessibility, you know, the other side of accessibility that we need to keep remembering. Technology is such a great equalizer for marginalized populations, and that's a component of digital trust. But that's not what you asked about, so I'll step off my soapbox and talk a little bit about
that's a fine soapbox. That's a fine one. We have like 3 minutes before I think we might get dragged off the stage.
Sure, I totally get that. And we're standing in between you and fun, so I understand that as well. K through 12 really sets up higher education well. Our students are coming from a place where they have a lot of trust in their school districts, right? And in their schools and teachers. And even though something magical doesn't happen really when they turn 18, you know, we have these young adults coming into our environment and they're poised to trust us. And one thing that we've maybe done poorly, but that we're doing better, is we've just sort of couched our interactions with students, calling them adults and saying we're doing this thing because the law allows us to do this thing. And we're not taking our students, and sometimes even our faculty and staff, a little bit down the privacy journey to help them understand their own need to protect their own privacy, to give them their own agency, and to give them sort of the interactions to really trust us that we are acting in a benevolent way with respect to data, and in a way that encourages them to interact with us. The main difference between higher ed and K-12 is children and adults, right? But there is no magic switch. And that's really the thing that I want to hit on. You know, what you're doing with digital trust and the way in which you're approaching it is really just going to help your learner. And that's an amazing thing.
Well, oh my gosh, there's so many things here that I love. And I'm going to ask Kate to look through the chat, because we do have a few minutes, so we could pull out a question. But I love the notion that we might be intentional about keeping the things that we've learned, frankly, in the last year, and then figuring out how to take them as levers, how to think of them as opportunities to then even deepen these practices, or keep the practices and refine them and polish them and put them to incredible use. I know as all of us are thinking about going into the fall and figuring out what the fall is going to look like for us, it is really easy to focus on that and not really appreciating some of the lessons that we've gone through, and then figuring out how to make the most of them. Hey, Kate, is there a question that we should throw at our esteemed colleagues?
Sure. So there's a couple of interesting threads here, and I'm going to leave it up to y'all to duke it out, which is, we have one thread that's sort of posing as a user, the question is, are you using my data to make my experience and the experience of others better? Or are you using it for gain or profit for the organization, which is interesting in an education space, because some of us are for profit and some of us aren't. We can go down that direction. Or somebody else brought up an idea, or I think it was Lorenzo brought up this idea of what if we live in a world where there's body cams on teachers? So we're going in a couple of different directions there. And I turn it over to y'all, to which seems more intriguing. It looks like we have about 10 minutes. So if we want to, would you guys like to
All right, Jim, Joanna, body cams on teachers. Which one wins the cage match on these two topics?
So I think I have a 18-year-old who just graduated from high school and got in trouble this past year for sneaking into the band room. It was caught on some sort of camera, sneaking into the band room so that he could practice his instrument. So body cams on teachers and surveillance in school certainly is a very sexy topic, but it's creepy and scary and has lots of nuance. Are you ready to talk about it, Jim?
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of redirect it a little bit and just kind of open it up to kind of data collection and surveillance, because I think there's a lot to unpack on that one, and I really want to acknowledge Elizabeth's comment about are you using my data to benefit me, and I think that's a really critical piece. This was a thread that was mentioned in the EDUCAUSE article that my colleagues Jasmine Park and Amelia Vance did a couple months back, kind of surveying students' attitudes around privacy and trust. And that idea about, I'm okay if you're using the data to benefit me, but I also have, I don't have a high degree of confidence maybe in the quality of the data. I think there are some things that we've seen just in the news recently in higher ed kind of around this area of surveillance and data collection. And are we using data that I think of as a technologist, log data in an LMS? Is it really kind of forensic quality level to be used to determine if someone's cheating? Those are some really interesting questions. I like the idea of what questions should you be asking when you're looking at a product, and certainly online proctoring is a really kind of a hot topic. As I was kind of thinking about this, I did want to throw this out as a takeaway. There's a really good University Business article around proctoring, and they had 5 questions that I really liked around, what are the questions that you would ask when you're doing online proctoring. And I think they could apply to a lot. And I'm just going to give the 5 and then kind of leave it there for, are we solving the right problem? Is this technology solving the right problem? Are we adequately protecting the student's privacy? Do our purchasing decisions and contract terms align with our commitments to our students? Are we supporting our faculty by providing adequate information? And are we providing, in this case, the business purpose anti-cheating measures? Are we prioritizing that over student success? And I looked at a lot of things on this, and I thought those were the 5 things that I thought were really useful in this conversation.
All right, we've got more time though. So another question. Joanna, I'm going to make you pick a question.
No, I was going to respond. I was trying to type a chat, but I can't type, so you can unmute all at the same time.
It's complicated.
It does get complicated. One of the great things about the 5 questions that are in the University Business article, and I'd encourage you to read it because it's a quick read, but it's very, very interesting, is it really sort of puts the institution in the shoes of thinking of itself as a steward for the people that it represents, right? So the legal notion of a steward is somebody who has a duty to another, right? You have a duty to act in their best interest. You have the duty to be loyal to them. You have the duty of care. So you act in a reasonable, responsible manner. And that's what these questions do. They really encourage the institution to be a steward. You need to be a steward for your students. You need to be a steward for your faculty. You also need to sort of be a steward for the institution itself. And that's sort of that meta institutional risk question. And I think if you think about your institution as a steward, it sometimes makes the questions about what can we do versus what should we do much, much easier to digest, right? You're putting yourself in the shoes of another and trying to figure out where their agency is and where you create these interactions that establish that kind of trust. And I love that notion.
Well, and it's, data stewards are a thing a lot of organizations have. We have them here at ASU. But then thinking about taking a moment and thinking deeply about data stewardship, I'm thinking, what does that actually mean? What's that responsibility? That's a beautiful thing. And I appreciate, back to some of what Jim was saying, how hard that is. Because empathy isn't something that you build in a 90-minute workshop. It actually takes some real time, right? And a deep appreciation to some of the comments in our chat about really understanding the nuances of the data and the experiences we have, so we're not just jumping to hypotheses or, yeah. Okay, so Kate, are there other questions? We have like 5 minutes left, I think.
So John Mott brings us around to a sort of a potential new edge to this, right? So John makes the point of, so he's an ed tech CEO, and he's working towards a place where his company monetizes the value they can add to individuals' data that the individual themselves owns and operates, like via sort of an SSI wallet, right? So pushing that monetization opportunity out to the student in a place where the student controls their data. That is a real paradigm shift, especially coming off of Joanna, you speaking to the fact that if we're in education, we are stewards. And also let's build on that sort of, there is no switch that turns a 17-year-old into an 18-year-old, therefore a child into an adult. What do you make of this developing opportunity for sort of, for learners to take more control over their own identity in a technical space? What do you think about that?
Oh, it makes me so nervous.
And I'm curious about why, because it's a complicated space.
It's a really complicated space. So when I'm trying to figure out things that are hard for me to figure out, I go to my kid, and he's 18 and he's encountering the world, right? And I'm sorry, doesn't have a clue. He's not home, so I can say that out loud right now. He's learning and he's going to make mistakes. And I think about all the mistakes that I made when I was young, and I'm so glad that technology wasn't available the way it is today to amplify those mistakes, either via social media or sharing more than I should have, or all of those sorts of things. And that just really, really scares me. At the same time, I bristle against the notion that a fiduciary might be paternalistic, right? We don't want to use our data or use our power or use our privilege, wherever you want to put the institution in that paradigm. We don't want to use that fiduciary role to stifle something that a user lawfully or has a moral right to do with their data, right? I mean, the best we can do is give them the tools, nag them maybe a little bit about things not to post on Facebook, and hope that we give them the tools to work appropriately, while at the same time answering that question for ourselves: are we doing the right thing with respect to this? And it's so tricky. I love the idea of being able to monetize my own data so that someone else can't. I mean, that feels like that's got a lot of agency for me. And I would need to think about that some more to think about what role should the institution have in that transaction.
Oh, I'm thinking about, what are those digital experiences we'd want to create so that you could make those decisions? And like, how would you then make your own determinations about the value of that data? And that value has got to be placed in context. And so, questions around selective disclosure and what that actually looks like, it gets to be some really interesting questions that could lead to some fantastic, although we have to be watchful too, opportunities for technology. I think I'm going to look to my team and see whether or not we have time for one more question or if we're at time.
I think we might actually be right at time.
Okay.
So let's please join me in offering a huge thank you. It's been so lovely, Joanna and Jim, to have you come and speak. So many interesting, sort of provocative topics. If only we had more time, I think we could spend a couple hours shooting the breeze on all of these really exciting topics. Thank you so much. And Donna, thank you. And I'll turn it over to you to introduce our next group. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Joanna and Jim.